I'm a teacher and I'll always be in that sense, and hopefully always also a student. That's the more important thing. If you believe you know the truth without even asking questions, then you don't think. And for me, that's the biggest threat to being human. We need to teach people the scientific process. Skeptical inquiry, testing, retesting are vitally important for the public to make them responsible adults in a pseudo-democratic society. We are creating an Earth already at the carbon levels in the atmosphere that has not been seen for over 5 million years.
What do you say to people that say that climate change is just a natural cycle?
It's not rocket science. It's just basic chemistry. It's the fact that it's already happening. There's physical impacts of climate change, sea level rise, storms, and all the things people talk about. But I think almost more worrisome is the socio-political impacts of climate change. 500 million to 1 billion people who are going to be displaced. So if you're worried about a few thousand boat migrants, you're going to have a flood of people.
We will build a great wall.
What's becoming clearer is it does seem to be generational, that young people are recognizing the impacts and need to respond to climate change.
The young people want to be heard.
It seems to me the only way ultimately is give information and try and educate them, how to sift that information, how to check sources. That's the kind of training we need to do in schools. And if you don't have those tools, then you're much more easily manipulated by whoever is in power.
The world is changing. Inspiration is everywhere. It has never been so easy to connect, share, and bring people together. We're learning from others and finding the best in ourselves. Challenging our beliefs. Sharing our vulnerability. Overcoming our fears. Transforming ourselves so we can transform the world. How far can we go? This is LondonReal. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is Lawrence Krauss is the guy that makes physics interesting. He's a professor, but he's also known for interviewing Johnny Depp on stage in front of 3,000 people. And his Origins podcast has guests like Ricky Gervais and Noam Chomsky. And I had an amazing conversation with Lawrence the second time he was in the studio. We talked about black holes, about global warming, and all the crazy stuff he's up to lately. You also might remember him from that movie, The Unbelievers, with Richard Dawkins, where they debate people about religion. Lawrence always has something interesting to say, so I know you're going to enjoy this incredible episode with Lawrence Krauss. This is LondonReal. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is Lawrence Krauss, the theoretical physicist, cosmologist, and best-selling author. You've written over 300 scientific publications and 9 books, including the bestsellers The Physics of Star Trek and A Universe from Nothing. You've also served as the Science Policy Committee for President Barack Obama, acted in Hollywood films, and run the Origins Project Foundation, dedicated to hosting public panel discussions and podcasts on science, culture, and social issues. Lawrence, welcome back.
Well,
to
it's great
LondonReal.
to be back here. It's great to be in the new studio and be with you again. It's 10 books, but who's counting? and I should say, because of that, the foundation is a separate foundation from the podcast. They're two separate things.
Okay, good.
And I have to say that because the foundation is a tax-exempt or entity, and the podcast is.
Well put, well put.
Yeah, okay.
And you've been podcasting like a madman lately.
Yes,
You've had Noam
yeah.
Chomsky on, and Penn Jillette, and a bunch of other people in the camp. Ricky Gervais.
And yeah, it's a great mix of. It's an amazingly fun, eclectic, and exhausting mix.
You're copying us.
Well, I'd like to think I'm complimenting you.
And video is super important for you.
Yeah, yeah.
And if anyone hasn't seen your movie, The Unbelievers, with Richard Dawkins, it's really well shot. It's a great film, and you have the same guys working for you.
The same crew that made that movie is making the podcast, and we wanted to try and produce a podcast with really high production value, so you can listen to it in the car, as a lot of people listen to podcasts, but you can watch the whole thing, and it's beautifully produced. And while we and I love your studio. And what we built a really neat studio in Phoenix where we have filmed some of them, but in order to get the people we've gone around the world. In fact, that's the reason I'm in London now. We're just recording a number of fascinating ones. I won't mention names.
Right, and you always cut across barriers and genres. I mean, people know you for having Johnny Depp on the stage, with 3,000 people having conversations about all sorts of things. How do you get to know all these people?
It's a mystery to me. It sort of builds on it. One thing happens and then another. I am fortunate to have a wide network of friends and people who know me. Obviously began, for the most part, except for the scientific community, most of whom I've known through my science. But beyond that, with the books, it sort of began, and it's always surprising to me, it still is, when someone I really admire knows who I am or is a fan. In fact, with Johnny, I met him because he came to a lecture of mine and was backstage, and they said, there's someone backstage who wants to see you. And I came in, and there he was. He said, I watch you every day on TV, and I felt like saying, well, that's interesting. And it was a surprise. But I'm a huge fan of Johnny's, and we are mutual admirers. But so it just picks up, and for me, the connection between science and culture is really important. So I've tried in my books and in everything to try and point out science is just part of our culture like everything else. It's not separate. It's not different than art or literature or TV or movies. And I've had fun to try and reach out in different ways. So these things sort of happen one thing after another, and I'm kind of surprised. I'm so surprised when people agree to be on or do something with me or for me, and then anyway, it builds up. But it's been neat and exciting and challenging.
And tell me about London. What are your feelings like when you come to a place like this? What do you think about London when you're baking in the heat in Phoenix?
Well, happily, by the way, I don't live in Phoenix anymore. I moved up to Oregon, which is much nicer.
Okay.
And we film in Phoenix, so I fly down. I used to commute to Australia, where my wife was, so commuting from Portland to Phoenix is much easier. I'm a big fan of London, and I hope to be a big fan of London in the future, if London is still here after Brexit. But we'll see. It's very comfortable. I actually have been teaching part-time at a place called New College of Humanities. I would come in and give 3 or 4 lectures a year and stay for a period of 3 or 4 weeks. And it's very comfortable for me. I grew up in Canada too, so the British influence was big on me there anyway.
And what about from a science perspective?
Oh well, I've always had great colleagues here, and that's, to be serious, that's always my initial concern about Brexit, by the way, early on, was all my science colleagues. Because what I don't think people realized, and maybe now they do, but Britain gets so much in the way of science because of its connection to Europe. There's money flowing in to support scientific research that's going to disappear. And one of the first things that I thought is, well, in a mercurial sense, I thought, oh good, this would be a great chance to recruit all our colleagues from Britain because they'll all want to move to the United States. But then we elected Donald Trump, and so it's we've had our own issues. But it's a real problem. But there's a great research establishment. I used to spend time up in Cambridge and almost took a position to succeed my friend Richard Dawkins, actually at Oxford. And it's a position of public understanding of science. And what I didn't want to do though was move to Oxford full time, because I think if you're talking about public misunderstanding of science and you don't have a foot in the United States, that's probably the heart of popular misunderstanding of science. Right now, our government is based on misunderstanding of science, and so I didn't want to move full time, and that was a factor. But it's a vibrant and amazing city, and the UK in general. I learned to love it back actually when I was a graduate student. I was up in St Andrews for a month, and that's before I knew how to golf. I've been back since there, and then 20 years later I went back to lecture there. So I have a long history of throughout the UK, Durham, and it's a great tradition of physics, obviously, and science, and education, and so it's it's a pleasure to visit. And I try and make sure I interact with colleagues. And we actually filmed, happily, part of The Unbelievers in the Royal Society building, thanks to, at the time, Martin Rees, who we've now done a podcast with, which will appear in a little while, who was the president of the Royal Society, as well as having been head of the Trinity College in Oxford and the Royal Astronomer.
Yeah, it's nice.
Let us film there, and it was a wonderful place to film.
I was at the Royal Society when the Imperial College folks did their presentation on the LSD research, and Professor David Nutt and Robin Carhart Harris and all of the whole crew was there. It's a great place.
It is a neat place, and I was glad they let me and Richard. Well, Richard's a member of the Royal Society. That was, I have to say, as a kind of, and the Canadian, and a sort of maybe a, I'm not sure, an Anglophile in that sense, but if I'd taken, as a Canadian, if I'd taken the job in the UK, I could have been eligible to be in the Royal Society, and that just sounded so good.
That would make your mom happy.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, now it would. My mother was, very unhappy when I decided to become a physicist.
Really? What did she want you to do?
Be a doctor, of course.
Of course.
And in fact, when I was at, I got my first job was it was a pretty prestigious job at Harvard right after I got my PhD, and right after I heard I got that job, I was in Boston at the time, and she phoned my then wife at the time. We'd just gotten married, and I was out of the house, and she said, there's still time to convince him to go to medical school. What's he want to do, get chalk on his hands? Anyway, now she's proud, but for a long time, she wanted my brother to be a lawyer and me to be a doctor. And my brother became a lawyer. In fact, he became worse. He became a professor of law. I
think you did pretty good, Lawrence.
Yeah, anyway. Yeah, no, it's okay now.
So
She's
last
happy
Friday, I went down to Westminster to witness the global climate protest. And it was pretty fascinating. We actually took my film crew down there because we're making a whole documentary about all sorts of things, from plant medicine to childhood trauma to you name it. And I went down and I saw all these children protesting. I'd never actually seen that before. Parents and kids and a lot of 10-year-olds and 14-year-olds, and it was massive. And I'd never seen that, and I just wondered what your thoughts were.
Well, I think we'll see. I mean, I'm always skeptical. The fact that young people are involved is particularly important. I was just having this conversation with a writer, Ian McEwan, who I was talking to yesterday here in England, and you realize that there can be a sea change. The example that always hit me was gay rights. I mean, 15 years ago, the thought that it would just be accepted in the United States to have gay marriage was just impossible. But when I realized what was going to happen when my daughter, maybe this was 20 years ago, and my daughter was a teenager, and she had gay friends, and it was nothing. And I realized for them, being gay was nothing. And then I realized, well, no matter what old white men on the Supreme Court or in Senate think, the next generation, for them, it's nothing. And you can see things change instantaneously when generationally you can produce that change. And what's really becoming clearer, I was more skeptical a year ago, but what's becoming clearer is it does seem to be generational in the sense that it cuts across political lines, that young people are recognizing the impacts and need to respond to climate change in a way that just isn't happening for older people. And when that happens, that means things can change quickly, which they have to, by the way. I mean, it's already, in many ways, too late, because climate change is already happening and having severe impacts. I actually just wrote a piece, which I just got translated into German today, so I re-released it, but it was on the dark side of climate change, because there's physical impacts of climate change, sea level rise, storms, and all the things people talk about. But I think almost more worrisome, because they are more immediate and may trigger effects that are much scarier for humans across the planet, is the socio-political impacts of climate change. And the example I used at the time was a big issue in the United States, and to some extent in England, because it's one of the hearts behind Brexit, I think, is question of immigration, of illegal immigration. And as I used to say in Australia, it's nothing. When the Australian government stopped their carbon tax, but at the same time was worried about boat people coming in and they put them on this awful island outside Australia, they wouldn't let them come in. I said, well, you have probably 500 million to 1 billion people who are going to be displaced because of climate change in the next 30 years, say. Sea level rise and droughts, or all sorts of things. And where's the nearest place they can go with a lot of empty space? It's Australia. So if you're worried about a few thousand boat migrants, you're going to have a flood of people. And the United States right now, of course, Trump and his wall, and worry about immigration from Central and South America, you can already see that climate change is impacting, producing droughts, and what it causes is people to want to move, especially in agrarian society. So I did the data and pointed out that the same government that's sort of denying or not attempting to do nothing to impact on climate change, in fact, negatively impacting, because one of the ways to get people to not immigrate is to help them grow things where they are. But the aid programs that the United States used to do to help people doing that are being cut back. And so they're worried about 50,000 migrants now, but it's estimated that maybe 10% of the population of Mexico may want to move over the next 40 years because of that impact. So it's called the dark side of climate change, but migration will produce these incredible tensions as it's doing, and that breeds xenophobia. It also breeds unrest in various countries. And so I'm worried about those indirect impacts of climate change in a world that is connected whether we want it or not. And while the physical aspects of climate change can't be stopped, I mean, we've already put in the atmosphere enough carbon dioxide that will last over 1,000 years in the atmosphere to have an impact of a few degrees, okay? So we can, of course, try and curtail it and make it not 5 degrees, that we should be acting. And I'll tell you the reasons why we should act quickly on that. But what will happen more immediately are the indirect impacts and tensions and wars, and it's poor countries and places that are hotbeds from Bangladesh to Pakistan, and some of those countries like Pakistan have nuclear weapons, and there's all of these indirect effects that we have to realize. And that's why, by the way, in the United States, while certain people may deny the existence of climate change, if you look at the national security community, they've been looking at that and recognizing the reality of it for a long time, because they have to. They have to look at the real world, not the world that's trying to be sold to people. And they have to say, what are the security implications and how can we address them?
If like 40 million people try to immigrate.
Yeah, or if it causes social disturbances in a country that has weapons of mass destruction,
right,
or countries that are allied, or countries that say become unlivable, but right now provide a significant amount of fossil fuel. I mean, there's all sorts of social of security implications, and they have to look at that.
Right.
And so it's just like Noam Chomsky, who we've had in our podcast as well, and is an old friend for many years, used to tell me when I was a student, did my PhD at MIT, and I would sit in his classes, that if you want to understand what's really happening, read the business magazines and the business pages, because in order for those people to make money, they have to know what's really happening, and they have to. So they're not. There's all this gloss and propaganda that's thrown out. But if you really want to tie into what's really happening in the world, what you really want to do if you can be a successful business person, and so he used to say that, and it's true. If you look at the business or military, you'll see what's really happening.
And can you expand more on this kind of 1 degree or 2 degree versus 5 degree, and what we can do and why it's important to act now?
Well, let me first promote. I had a wonderful podcast which already appeared with Dan Schrag, who's a professor at Harvard, a geophysicist, who was actually also. I advised Obama before he became president. I was on that committee, but when he was president, I was an advisor. Right. But Dan was on his council of advisors for 8 years, and he's an expert on climate change. And it's an amazing episode about discussing the physical implications of climate change, and what we might do to deal with it. It is, on the one hand, terrifying, but on the other hand, inspiring, because the point is that by recognizing what's already happened and what is inevitably happening, we do have abilities, technological abilities, to try and deal with things. Not to necessarily reverse climate change. Extracting carbon from the atmosphere would be wonderful, but that's quite a challenge. But to try and find technologies that are going to either mediate it in the future or allow us to change the way we live as a society to deal with the impacts of climate change. But Greenland, of course, which Trump wanted to buy, is of great interest because it's, I guess when I first started to get concerned about climate change was looking at the record over the last 500,000 years of sea level rise and temperatures. We can actually correlate those two things by looking at ice cores in the South Pole and other places. We can actually measure the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, the mean temperature, and the sea level rise. And sea level has changed by plus or minus, not inches, but 80 meters over that time. And so when you realize that, you've got to say, well, it's true that predictions of global modeling and climate modeling have uncertainties. But when you have the possibility of sea level rise, not by inches, but by meters or tens of meters, you got to ask, is it worth the risk? Is it worth hedging your bets and saying, well, we can't prove that things will necessarily rise by that amount. But here's one example. Right now, the Earth isn't heating up as much as it could because that heat is going into the ocean. The oceans haven't yet equilibrized that heat. But that's good for us right now, but it's bad in the long term because it means that whatever we turn off everything right now, that energy is in the oceans, and the oceans are going to eventually equilibrize that. And a fraction of sea level rise that occurs right now is not from ice melting in Antarctica and Greenland, but actually the fact that it's a simple fact of physics that the coefficient of expansion, that water expands when it gets hotter. So a fraction of the 10 or 20 millimeters of average sea rise that's happened now is just simply from ocean heating. But if we turn everything off, that ocean heating is going to continue, and that because it takes centuries for that energy to equilibrize in the ocean and heat the whole thing up. And Greenland, which already is losing more ice than most models predicted, and could catastrophically lose that ice, because what happens when the water melts on the surface, it goes down below and basically provides a kind of lubricant for the ice to slide off into the ocean. If all that ice disappears in Greenland, you're talking about meters of sea level rise, which is devastating. Now, the first world, in some sense, can deal with it, although Florida is already, I was just reading, Florida, they're already mitigating it. There are places you can't rebuild your house in Florida right now because of sea level rise, okay? Mm-hmm. And it's going to get only worse. But the rich countries, New York can try and build a moat around it, okay? But Bangladesh or various countries in the South Pacific just can't. And that population, and those are dense, poor populations, and they've got to go somewhere. But here's something interesting. It's a tidbit that I was fascinated by in the podcast. One of the reasons to listen to it or watch it. So global sea levels will rise when the ice melts from Greenland, okay? But interestingly, when the ice melts off the Greenland ice sheet into the ocean, the sea level near Greenland will actually go down. Now, I could give you a quiz. Why would that happen? But I'm not going to do it. There's also you'd be
go back to my physics
again.
No,
well, I would never have guessed it either. It's the gravitational attraction. There's so much mass on top of Greenland and ice that it attracts right now the water towards Greenland. When that ice is gone, that gravitational attraction goes away. So near Greenland, the water sea levels will actually go down. The physics of this is fascinating, if it wasn't, in some sense, terrifying at the same time.
Right.
Anyway.
What do you say to people that say that climate change isn't human-caused, that it's just a natural cycle?
Well, I say, it's nice to say that, but there's not only is there no evidence of it, I guess if it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it's probably a duck. And the point is, it's not rocket science. You know that carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas, as is methane and other things, and you know the energy coming in from the sun. You can do the energy flows. And you can say how much heat is being trapped by carbon dioxide. What are the predicted generic? I mean, climate modeling in detail is very complicated. But what's the energetics of energy in and energy out, and therefore energy stored? And you do that, and you find out the impacts of what's happening are completely consistent with what that simple prediction. Now you say, well, maybe that could be just totally wrong. But when a simple calculation that's of basic physics gives you something that generically agrees with what's happening, you should suspect that that's probably the case. And as I say, it's not what people used to say was, well, these models are uncertain. And there's still some people who, even some scientists who I've debated, who would argue that, well, the modeling of exactly what sea level rise, what temperature increase is going to occur are uncertain. And they are. Uncertainty is a key part of science, which is important because we can estimate the uncertainty. But it's not prediction in the future. It's the fact that it's already happening, that you can see sea level rise already happening. You can see ocean acidification happening because what happens is that when there's more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, some of it gets dissolved in the ocean water as carbonic acid, making the ocean more acidic. And you can see the pH level in the ocean changing by exactly the amount you'd predict if the carbon dioxide level is increasing. It's just basic chemistry. And that, of course, is impacting on, and will impact on oceans 2.0, on ocean life. So these things are really happening now. And I think that's the more important aspect of this, is that sure, there's uncertainties, and whether in 2100 the temperature increase will be 5 degrees or 3 degrees or 10 degrees, which again doesn't sound like a lot. But 5 degrees is more than the temperature change from ice ages to the hottest areas we know. We are creating an Earth that has already at the carbon levels in the atmosphere that has not been seen for over 5 million years. I mean, it's Earth 2.0, and it's already that way right now. And the last little, you got me on a soapbox, but the last thing I'll say about this is people used to say, well, we have, one of the arguments that certain people use in the United States is to say, well, yeah, this may be a problem, but we can't afford to deal with it right now. I mean, we've got other pressing financial problems. Now, of course, one of the responses is cleaning up after hurricanes, it costs a lot more than preventing in some ways. And so money spent preventing problems usually is a lot less than cleaning up afterwards. Plus the economic opportunities that come from developing new technologies that address these problems is one thing. But it's more than that. It's that, so because every bit of carbon we add to the atmosphere now stays there, what we've added in all of human industrial activity is there already. And if we want to keep the level below a certain amount, and it used to be around below 400 parts per million, and now at 415 already, the problem is, you say, what is required? What kind of breaks or changes to the world economy do you need to do? Well, 10 years ago, to keep the levels down to the IPCC target level, you would have had to cut carbon 5% per year. But because in the intervening 10 years, in the inter-decade, we put in 60 billion tons of carbon each year, roughly, I think, into the atmosphere. Because we've been doing that, now to reach the same level, you'd have to cut it 9%. But if we don't do that, you see what happens is every year you continue to add that, the challenge to technology to keep things at the level you want at is much greater. So it's not, you can't push 20 years into the future and say, well, we'll deal with this problem 20 years in the future, because the problem will be a very different one 20 years in the future.
Are you hopeful? Are we going to figure this out?
It depends on the day. I think that I have great faith in technology to be able to address problems, and in scientists and creative scientists and engineers being able to address problems. So in that sense, I'm hopeful.
And the children.
And the children, yeah, to get back to your original question, which we deviated from, the fact that young people seem universally to be addressing this problem means that certainly there'll be a consensus, at least in the first world, that this problem has to be dealt with by people who will then be in political power and who will, in the interim, be able to vote. Gives me great faith. But at the same time, the negative part of my consciousness tells me that why I'm worrying more is humans' ability to govern, to think globally, deal with the socio-political problems that are going to result. I think technologically we can deal with it, but I just, if I look around the world now and I see what's happening in terms of xenophobia and denial and the ways that technology can impact on changing people's views in a way that can impact on democracy itself, I have severe concerns.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I mean, it's one thing when 40,000 people are trying to cross a border. It's another thing when 40 million people are leaving their country via boat because they can't survive.
Yeah, and you can exactly, and you can affect public opinion in two ways, and the way it will be affected is to make sure that the people that threats, that these people are viewed as threats, as they are being now. The simplest way, look, that manipulated Brexit, the idea that there's this horde of people from illegal immigration into Europe that are going to be in England, and then the England can't be England anymore. The most effective way to govern people is by making them afraid. It was, I think Goebbels, who said in Nazi Germany that democracy or dictatorship doesn't matter. You want to make people do what you want them to do, make them afraid. And I think that that's the effective way of dealing with things right now. And you make people afraid and they're willing to vote or act against their own self-interest because of that fear. And how can you overcome fear? Well, I'm an educator, so I'm biased, but it seems to me the only way ultimately is to give information and try and educate. And that's one of the reasons why I do some of the things I try and do, and is to try and open up and get people thinking about these problems, not necessarily believing me or any of the people I may have on, but get them interested enough to begin to research the problems. And that means, in the modern world, not going into your echo chamber, not going into your favorite sites on the internet where you get all your information, which may be wrong or biased, but we're willing to look broadly. And it means training young people, the same young people who are not buying the nonsense that's being thrown at them by the propaganda about climate change. Skepticism in young people is, to me, the greatest hope. And I grew up in the 60s, and so for me, I saw young people protesting the war, and it created, for me at least at the time, I thought a generation of people who would say, we're not going to buy this nonsense. We're not going to buy the lies, and I had great hope for the world as a result. But that hope was misplaced in some sense. But breeding skepticism in young people is very important, and then training them to be skeptical and to figure out how to gain information. Not in a world where education before used to be just sort of throwing things at kids in schools and amassing a certain amount of information, but that's useless because there's more information in the iPad you're holding, if it's an iPad, than you could get in all schools. There's more misinformation too. And what we have to train young people to do, because it's too late for the old people, is to be able to learn how to tell the wheat from the chaff in what they get from the internet. How to sift out information, how to check sources. That's the kind of training we need to do in schools. Of course, we need to teach them how to read and write and do mathematics, but beyond that, the kind of learning tools that'll be necessary to be a productive and viable adult voting human being in the rest of the 21st century will be very different than it was before. And if you don't have those tools, then you're much more easily manipulated by whoever is in power.
Yeah, those are good thoughts. You were recently on this island in the South Pacific called Malekula.
Oh, yeah.
And observing some of the geothermal activity. And I thought you made an observation that humans maybe are just a tiny blip of insignificance on the planet in the long run.
Yeah, well, I mean,
I get that in my ayahuasca ceremonies too sometimes.
Well, we are. I think the illusion that we have significance is part of our problem. I mean, obviously, it's part of the religious problem that somehow the humans have dominion over the earth is a real problem for some evangelicals, for some not. But I mean, the notion that it doesn't matter what we do, God's going to take care of us. So that's a myth that has to be dispensed with. But more importantly, recognize the humility that we are, in a cosmic sense, completely insignificant. I mean, that's what I've written about in my books. The cosmos doesn't care whether we're here or not. In fact, to some extent, it's trying to kill us all the time. But even in a human sense, the energetics, the long-term history of the Earth, humans, there's no doubt humans are the first species that have dramatically, globally affected the Earth. I don't think any other species has done that particularly. But we're still just a blip. And you go to a volcano and you see the energy and that is harnessed in the Earth, and you realize how literally insignificant you are as a human being is a very powerful thing. It shouldn't disturb you. It should realize how fortunate you are that you have the opportunity to think, to act, to enjoy. And so I'm always amazed that especially some religious people talk about how it would be nice if scientists were more humble. And I always think, well, what's more humble? Recognizing you're an insignificant cognitive being who has consciousness on a remote planet in the middle of nowhere in a random galaxy in the middle of a universe that doesn't care about us, or saying the universe was created so we could exist. I mean, which is more humble?
I think I understand the answer to that one.
Okay.
And while we're just finishing this up, what do you think of Greta Thunberg and what she's done?
I've been watching. I mean, I'm always skeptical, especially people who catch the media's attention, but she's really impressed me as a young person. I tweeted a small speech she said, just because, she was testifying before Congress, and one of these Congress people basically more or less said, why should we listen to the scientists on climate change? And she looked at him saying, what kind of stupid, this is a 16-year-old, and she said, why would we not listen to the scientists? I mean, it's an obvious question, but the fact that you need a 16-year-old to say it is remarkable, and she does it with such poise. I think she captured the imagination, and the fact that she's impacted, on this climate strike thing, I'm always a little worried of gimmicks, but the fact that it raises awareness is very good, and she is, as a young spokesperson, is remarkably powerful. Now, I don't know what group she has behind her and the rest. And I've seen lately reactions that do worry me. I mean, so I do events, and we're running educational events. We're taking a group to the Mekong to look at the one of the things the Origins Project Foundation is doing is running a trip with Richard Dawkins and a climate scientist, Richard Somerville, to the Mekong Delta in January, and there are still some berths available, so people should go and look, to look a number of things besides the culture of that region, but also it's an area that's going to be directly impacted by climate change in a large amount. And some people are saying, well, yes, but you shouldn't travel. There's all these people basically saying, and I was told that the Heathrow they were thinking about closing it or canceling flights a few days ago because some climate activists were going to be flying drones into Heathrow to try and limit that because they're objecting to planes, which of course do produce greenhouse gases. But to argue that we have to stop global travel to deal with this, I think is impractical at best. It's just unrealistic. We need people. You can have an impact and not have everyone take solar-powered boats around the world. We just can't sustain the global marketplace the way we do. And we can also design planes, of course, that use less fossil fuels. We can develop technologies that'll do that. Maybe even, although I'm skeptical, maybe even electric-powered planes at some point. But
still make the trips because the education is important.
Well, I think we can't. And not only that, I actually think for young people, the most important education they can get is to see another culture.
Right.
And so when the reaction that comes, and it was nice of her as maybe a publicity stunt, or maybe she really believes it, to take this solar-powered boat across the Atlantic Ocean to come to the United States. It was a demonstration that she could do that. But I don't want people to get the wrong idea that we have to. In fact, that's the biggest way to stop people from taking action, to say that they have to give up everything they have in order to fight the problem.
Right.
We can't do that.
That's the wrong attitude.
That's the wrong attitude completely. We have to be careful and rethink certain things. We should try. I mean, those people who can become vegetarians probably become vegetarians because there's no doubt that meat industry produces a lot of climate change. If you can't become vegetarian, eat less meat. Sure, drive your car less, maybe. And one big thing, which is sort of the elephant in the room that's often not discussed, is the biggest contribution to pollution and climate change is population. So think about the size of the family you want to have. And that's one less child, and I hate to put it this way, people are going to get angry and think I'm awful, but one less child that you have is one huge impact on reducing, because it's the integrated lifetime of that child and the carbon that they're going to produce, and besides the impact on resources and everything else. And so I think there are many positive ways to address the problem without giving up everything you have. And the people who are trying to get people to react are threatening. People like Trump are saying, well, these people are going to take away everything you have for this climate change thing. They're going to destroy the economy. And then there are people who have hyperbole on the other side. Al Gore, who's actually in London this week to speak at the same group I'm speaking to, the How To Academy. I'm going to talk on Thursday, and I think he's maybe talking today or tomorrow. But he's pointed out that this is an opportunity for people to make money. It's an opportunity to develop new technologies. And if viewed that way, and that's what Obama used to say as well, that addressing climate change is an opportunity to develop new technologies that will productively help countries move into the 21st century at the same time as doing good.
Yeah, and if it doesn't make economic sense, it's hard to get people to do it. You can't really shame them into it, right?
No, I mean, you can't. I mean, you can shame people. Basically, look, I used to tell teachers, and I tell radio hosts and podcast people and salespeople the same thing, but I used to tell teachers, the biggest mistake any teacher makes is to assume their students are interested in what they have to say. But it's true of anyone. If you want to convince people to do something, no one's going to listen to me and talk. What I have to do is go to where they are, talk about something that they hold dear to themselves, and try and get them to think about it in those terms. And so, you can't shame someone, but you can get them to think about things and maybe convince themselves. So I think that you can do to some extent. But you're right, if people feel that their livelihood is threatened and the comfort and well-being of their children are threatened, they're not going to act. And I think what we have to convince people of, because it's true, is that if we don't act appropriately, the livelihood and well-being of their children will be affected. And that the fact that the children are recognizing that and saying, you are the ones who are leaving us this future, you won't have the future to deal with, we'll have to deal with it, and so you should be doing something now for your kids. That's probably the biggest problem in dealing with climate change, is it's a long-term problem, even though it has impacts now. Unlike, for a long time, I was chairman of the board of sponsors of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. We do the Doomsday Clock. And when I came in as that, we broadened it from just nuclear. The Doomsday Clock was about existential threats to humanity. Okay. And it was created by Oppenheimer and Einstein in 1947. I was very happy then to be the chair of it after all that time.
Because every year, Oppenheimer, after he was involved in the Manhattan Project,
after he was involved,
came back and said, this is bad.
Well, a lot of the scientists from the Manhattan Project came and said, we have to explain to the world the dangers of nuclear weapons so that we don't have nuclear wars. And the Doomsday Clock was designed to be a symbol that would present how close to midnight we were based on nuclear tensions. And so for 10 or 12 years while I was doing it, we'd set the Doomsday Clock every year. But we expanded it to include other existential threats, one of which was climate change. Okay. But at the same time, it's apples and oranges. Nuclear weapons are a huge threat. They remain so today. And tomorrow, the world in many ways could be dramatically changed if there was a nuclear...
John McNamara always said that's how we're going to go.
Well, I don't know. I don't.
He just said it was one of the biggest.
It's certainly the biggest. It is the biggest immediate existential threat, and the point is there are ways to go. Let me just, as long as we're talking disasters. Obviously, a global thermonuclear war is boom, world's over. Okay, we already even though we've reduced the number of thermonuclear weapons, we still have at least 5,000 in the United States, 5,000 in Russia. That's more than enough to do in the world. But forget that for the moment, and forget the fact that, by the way, a lot of them are still on trigger alert. There's no need, because we're not, we at this point still we're not yet back in the Cold War. We don't need to do that anymore, but we do. And an accident. And we've come so hair-trigger close to accidents over the last 50 years.
Trigger alert means if one fire's there, I'm going to fire, and then they all go.
Yeah, because you don't have enough time to assess. Right. And so the chain of command, you want to read, there's two really chilling books to read. One is Command and Control. And Daniel Ellsberg, who released the Pentagon Papers, has written a book called The Doomsday Machine. about his not just the time when he was working for the Rand Corporation and security, all of the near nuclear, not only nuclear threats, but when he discovered, for example, one of the myths is that it's only the president that can launch nuclear weapons. Well, that's a myth. And one of the other myths that many Americans think is that the United States has a no first use policy of nuclear weapons. It doesn't. It never said we won't be the first to use nuclear weapons. I mean, there are lots of scary things there. But one of the scary things was the realization that a distant nuclear war between, say, India and Pakistan, which might involve 200 nuclear weapons or 100, or recently, about 10 or 15 years ago, there was a physicist did a series of estimates of what would be the impact of a limited nuclear war. Obviously, India and Pakistan would be devastated, but a limited nuclear war with maybe 100 to 200 nuclear weapons exchanged between those two countries. It would produce a global impact on the climate that would probably kill 1 billion people, because it would produce global warming. Now, that's not, global cooling. Now, that's not the way we want to counter global warming, but the particulate material in the atmosphere would affect the global temperature in a way that would affect crops around the whole world for at least a decade. And so no country is an island. And I brought up those nuclear threats to point out that we haven't even dealt with those. But as hard as it is to deal with nuclear threats, dealing with climate change is harder because people keep thinking it's in the future, and the way people do risk analysis. And as a business person, you're familiar, people don't think about risks in a rational way. And the way people do risk analysis is such that if it's 50 years in the future, it's never worth dealing with it. And even if it's 10 years in the future, as far as people are concerned. And it is remarkable how people will be misplacing how they respond to risk.
To continue watching the rest of the episode for free, visit our website LondonReal.tv or click the link in the description below.